Hello, this is Dan with Orbital Guitars, and over the next 55 minutes I'm going to show you how I made this guitar. See you on the other side. Hello, this is Dan with Orbital Guitars, and this is the build video for a design that I have decided to call the Basilisk. You might notice this opening shot looks a little bit different from what my last few videos have looked like, and that's because this part was recorded quite a while ago. So there was a video I put out. It was I can't remember off the top of my head when exactly the video came out, but it was the hybrid body Chimera, and I had done that build back in late September of 2019. Of course, when I did that build, I made this neck blank that was big enough to make two necks. And so that's what I did. I made the neck for that guitar, and then I had leftover material that I did most of the work on to turn into the neck for this guitar. So what you're seeing right now is relatively old footage at this point from 2019. And that's 3 pieces of Pau Ferro glued together for a 3-piece neck. And so far all I've done here is route for the truss rod channel, test the fit, and here I am, you can see, cutting out the rest of this neck from the blank that I had used for the other neck. Of course, going this far back, this was using my old bandsaw, which was not nearly as good at making a lot of these cuts as my new one is. And just roughly cutting the front profile of the neck, and then gluing on the template and using a flush cutting router bit to get down to the final neck taper. So next up, I'm just going to drill for truss rod access from the headstock. So for a process like this, there's a very noticeable difference between hardwood necks and softer wood necks, in that the hardwood takes that drilling a lot better than softer wood does. Here I'm beginning to work on the fretboard. It's a nice piece of zebrawood that I've got there. I should point out, when I was making this neck, I didn't actually know what body it was going to be attached to eventually. I had the wood for the neck, I had the piece of zebrawood for the fretboard, so I was just kind of getting this part out of the way of putting those pieces together. So, back when I was making this, I didn't actually know that it was going to be going on to a body with a zebrawood top. So you're just gluing on the fretboard. Never have too many clamps. Not cranking down a lot of pressure, just adding enough clamps to make sure there's even pressure all the way along the entire length of the fretboard. And then of course once the glue is dry, using another flush cutting router bit to remove the excess off the sides. Of course that doesn't work very well once you're past the end of the neck, so I'll have to do something else for that part. In this case, because it's not another neck through like my last several, this removal is much easier and I can just do it with a small hand plane. And you're just cutting away some of the excess. And now I'm going to begin working on the neck carve. Now I don't, even at this point I still do not carve necks even mostly with an angle grinder. This is essentially just to make the whole back of the neck uniform. And I'll do the rest of the carving by hand, or rather with unpowered tools. Because contrary to what a lot of people like to say in the YouTube comment section, making things with power tools that you control with your hands is in fact still making something by hand. So in my initial carve for this, I was kind of experimenting a little bit. I was leaving the back of the neck totally flat and rounding over the sides. It was fine. It worked out pretty well on that chimera that I mentioned. I ended up changing it on this one later once I kind of finalized what the design for the whole guitar was going to be. At this point I'm working on cutting in the fret slots and then radiusing. It's kind of amazing to see just how much the grain pattern in this piece of zebrawood changes even when you're removing as little material as you do in radiusing. So if you've ever looked at the end of a piece of zebrawood, you can see just how quickly those lines in the grain move from where they are at the surface. So even removing a small amount of material can make a piece of zebrawood look completely different. Here I'm beginning to work on the inlay, just using my precision router base to cut out the pockets for that. And after I'm done with the precision router, I'm going to use some chisels to sharpen up those corners a little bit. Now for this inlay, I ended up using some crushed stone. In this case, it was turquoise. That is real turquoise, too. I'm just trying to carefully arrange the small bits of stone so that all of them are filling up that cavity as much as possible. Getting into the corners, up close to the edges. And then once I think I've got it relatively filled, I'm going to flood some thin super glue over all of it. Just to lock it all into place and fill in some of the gaps. And then what I did here is I took some a piece of ebony and sanded it into this little pile of dust here. And now I'm working that into the gaps in between the bits of turquoise because, I thought at the time, you look at a piece of turquoise, you can see those little black lines going through it, so ebony dust would not look out of place in here, as well as make the whole inlay a lot more solid. And of course, once the glue is dry, just going to sand it down with a leveling beam. Hey, this part looks familiar.
Several months later.
Alright, so that first part happened in 2019, in September of 2019. This part happened in, I believe, July of 2020. There's a little bit of time has passed. So what you're seeing here is I decided that I wanted to try putting some binding on this fretboard, so I've got a router bit there where the little guide on the top of the router, the guide bearing, is slightly smaller than the router bit itself, so it just removes a small amount of material from the edges of the fretboard. And then what I'm doing here is I've got a little piece of ebony that's an offcut from the fretboard on the very first neck I ever made. And just cutting that on the bandsaw into some thin strips, which I'm then going to carefully glue onto the fretboard here. And I'm putting the glue on this way, just very carefully, little bits of it by fingertip, because I didn't want any squeeze out, or at least as little squeeze out as I could possibly get. I particularly didn't want wood glue to be filling up any of the fret slots because I don't actually have the little saw tool that you use for cleaning out fret slots, so needed to be careful with that. And here, just for a bit of decoration, I've got this small piece of ebony that's for a headstock face, and of course I'm going to put that on the face of the headstock. And of course, the truss rod cover. I just carefully shape that by hand, and it fits perfectly. The grain wasn't an exact match, but it's pretty close. So then I'm ready to glue this on. So now, learning from my past mistakes, I'm drilling the holes for the tuners before the neck is attached to the body. And here, just taking the handsaw and cutting away some of the end of the headstock facing so that I can get the nut in there. It's a pretty snug fit. I end up going in and sanding a little bit more room in there for it. And then fitting in the truss rod cover and drilling for the screw that will hold it in place. So at this point I begin the fretwork, and of course because there's binding on here I can't have the fret tangs sticking out from the edges of the fretboard. I have to use the little cutter for those so that I can get the fret in. And it's also kind of nice that you don't actually see the tangs of the frets from the sides either. Definitely better than cutting the fret slot out through the binding as well. The only real downside to this that I could see is that it's a lot more wastage of the fret wire than you would get normally. So normally when I would install frets, I would cut them to almost exactly the right size to cover the whole fret slot from side to side. But because of the way I had to install these, I had to cut them a little bit extra long. And of course using a file to get the ends flush with the edges of the fretboard, and then using a fret end dressing file to round over the edges. And of course you've seen me level frets enough times, I didn't bother showing that part, just a little bit of crowning and now a little bit of polishing. Plenty of other videos on my channel and other channels where you can see the whole process of fretting, so I didn't really feel like I needed to show the whole thing again. So I'm sure somebody's going to pop up in the comments yelling at me, trying to tell me that I didn't level the frets, even though I just said that I did. Because to some people, if they didn't see it happen, then that must mean it didn't happen. You'd think they want these videos to be 5 hours long. Anyway, putting inside dots. Trying something a little bit different than usual. So normally for side dots, I've just got some little plastic dots that I put in. In this case, I decided to go a little bit more on theme and drill these holes a little bit wider and fill them with turquoise, just like the inlay. And then very carefully sanding them flat. So now that the neck is essentially done, or at least as done as it can be without a body, I'm going to go and work on the body. So here just working with some ash. So one big piece and cutting it down into two smaller pieces that I will then glue together to make the body. So at that point I've got the design of the body drawn out onto the wood and I'm just going to roughly cut it out. And then of course here we've got the top. Apparently I didn't actually film gluing that up, but here it is. It's a piece of Birdseye Zebrawood. A really pretty piece of wood. Had a bit of a warp to it initially, but cutting off the excess material largely flattened out what was left. And then of course get to glue the top onto the rest of the body. So I had one locating pin up at the top there, just to make sure that the top didn't slide around. As try as you might, sometimes the top just wants to move as you're clamping it down on the glue. So then once the glue was dry, I would have gone in and cleaned up the edges so that there wasn't any excess material sticking out. Now I'm going in and routing out the control cavity, or rather drilling out the control cavity. Next I'll be routing it out. So, of course, when you don't have a template for exactly what you need, you can always make one, or, like I did here, get some just small pieces of plywood and hold them in place with a bit of masking tape and super glue just to keep your lines straight. Well, I'm beginning to work on the neck pocket. I'm going to start by removing most of the material with the Forstner bit on my drill press. And then using a neck pocket template that I ended up making myself because the other one I have was not quite the right fit for the actual neck that I have. Went ahead and made a new one to be a perfect fit. Snug. So moving on from there, going to start drilling out the pickup cavities. And then finishing them off with the router. So now what I'm doing is just using my router table to put a bevel on the front and back of the body. With a fairly deep bevel. And of course, being very careful around the edges of the neck pocket because I don't want the thin wood there to chip or tear. So here you can see I've got some pilot holes on the body there that tell me where I wanted to put all the controls. So then just going in with a larger drill bit and drilling those to the appropriate size. And here, going back to using my precision router base and a very small router bit, I'm going to begin cutting out the slot for the blade switch. I'm just lowering the bit a little bit, moving it across, lower it a little bit more, cross again, and so on until I've gotten all the way through. And then drilling the holes for the screws that will mount the bridge. I had to do that by hand because the drill press that I have is not wide enough to actually reach the places where I needed to drill. And unfortunately, it also was not wide enough to reach the spots here where I have to drill for the string through. Here, once again, learning from past mistakes, I'm only drilling halfway through from the front, and I've got marked out on the back where these holes need to come out, so I'll go, once I'm done on the front, I'm going to flip this over and drill halfway through to the back so that the holes will meet in the middle. Doing it this way actually guarantees that the holes will be perfectly aligned on both the front and back of the body. So you're just using another Forstner bit, drilling a hole for the jack. And then drilling another hole, this one for the wires to get from the neck pickup through to the bridge pickup, and then I'll be drilling another hole to get from the bridge pickup into the control cavity. And of course drilling for the ground wire to the bridge. And at this point, none of my builds can be complete without a little bit of work done with an angle grinder. Here I'm going to just put in a comfort carve on the back of the body. And of course, the angle grinder being a very rough and aggressive tool, after I'm done with it, I'm going to use some hand files and rasps and my large random orbital sander to smooth out the carve. Here I decided to put a little carve here on the front as well for a little bit more access to the upper frets. Always a little bit nerve-wracking getting the angle grinder into a tight little area like that. So whenever you're doing that, you just know one little slip, and a lot of work is down the drain. That's most of the way there. I'll refine it a little bit more with hand tools before I'm done. At this point I decided this ash just looked a little bit too clean and bright. So let's burn it. And it's always really nice with ash how burning it really brings out the grain. And of course, one pass I didn't think was quite dark enough, so I went back for more. And of course, you have to do the edges as well. And still not dark enough. Then once you're done burning, you take a wire brush and scrape away all of the loose bits of char that are stuck on there. And then get it nice and smooth with some 320 grit sandpaper, this on my small random orbital sander. So now that the end of that neck pocket looks a little bit odd just being a square cut off like it is, so I decided to shape it a little bit farther. And it seemed like the quickest way to do that was to once again break out the angle grinder. Like I mentioned before, you don't want to slip with one of these because you can see just how quickly it tears through the wood if you let it. You're just carving down the back of the neck joint area for a bit smoother transition from the neck to the body. And of course then I have to burn it again to make it match. And then of course gluing in the neck. And you're just going out of my way to make sure that I don't leave any clamp marks either on the back of the neck joint or in the frets themselves. So just a piece of plywood on the back is a clamping caul, and then on the front I've got a towel wrapped around the same radius block that I used to radius the fretboard so that it shouldn't put any unusual pressure on any part of the frets, but rather put equal pressure all the way across the frets. So here I'm going to make the back plate. I'm just using an offcut from the top. And after roughly cutting it out, going to go to the spindle sander to finely shape it. And then making my final adjustments just using a leveling beam. And it's a good fit. And then of course just drilling for the screws that will hold it in place. And it seems I had a live audience. But moving on, here I'm beginning to work on the knobs. I could have gone and bought some knobs. I actually had some knobs laying around I could have used, just some black metal barrel knobs, but I decided to get a little bit fancier with this guitar. So here I've got just an odd bit of zebra wood. You can tell my first attempts didn't quite work out like I had hoped. Just using a big round bit to cut the rough outer shape of the knobs. Then I'm going to use a step drill, kind of open up the top end, because I'm going to do something else a little bit tricky with these. And of course the round bit didn't go all the way through, so I'm having to cut these out on the bandsaw. So here's another offcut of ebony from that old fretboard I had mentioned earlier. It's the same ebony that I used for the binding on the fretboard. But I'm going to put this little ebony dot in the center of the top of both knobs, just for decoration. Of course, you might notice that ebony doesn't totally fill the hole there, so I'm going to put a surround of more turquoise there. And then of course sand away the excess turquoise so that the top of the knob is flat and smooth. You can tell I'm getting close to done when the ebony dust starts to show up on the leveling beam. And just to make sure the knobs stay in place, I'm going to be putting in a couple of set screws. Just very carefully drilling the hole for that by hand. And then of course I need to get these smooth, so using that set screw that I just put in, I've attached the knob to a small wooden dowel, stuck that in my drill press, and I'm using it as a makeshift lathe to allow me to effectively sand the whole knob. And just working my way up through several different grits of sandpaper, ending at 320. So now we move on to finishing. So here I'm using the Crimson Guitar's guitar finishing oil. I've used this oil once before this and had some difficulties with it. Fairly certain I figured out what I was doing wrong before and got much better results this time. Of course, using the same oil finish on every part of the guitar so that it all matches. Normally you wouldn't put on a second coat straight away, but since the first coat had entirely soaked in, I decided to go ahead and immediately do the second coat on the top. And here's the reason I really like burning the ash for the back of the body here, because once you put the finish on, it gets this really warm sort of glow to it that you can't really get without the wood being burned first. Just very pretty. And in addition to that, burning ash in particular, because it burns away some of that thinner grain down in the grain lines there, you get a real textured feel to the back of the body, which is also quite nice. After I'm done applying the oil, I ended up doing, I believe, 3 coats on the back, and I think I did 4 coats on the front. Now I'm applying some shielding paint to the inside of the back cavity, and the pickup pockets, and the control cavity itself. Yeah, can anybody else tell that I'm doing this whole voiceover in one take without a script? Because I sure can. Alright, so here I'm putting in the ferrules for the string through. Just some plain old black ferrules. And then for the few that need it, just tapping them in a bit with the hammer there, and a little piece of wood so that I can avoid damaging the back of the body or the finish. And now I can work on assembly. You can see I've already got the two knobs and the blade switch in there, and then just installing the bridge. And we're here applying some fretboard oil. I was somewhat concerned when I was working on this that with the Zebrawood fretboard and a Zebrawood top that the fretboard and the top wouldn't stand apart very much, and that is part of the reason why I put on ebony binding. But it was kind of a relief when I started oiling the fretboard that piece of wood ended up being a bit lighter than the top on the body, so there is some separation there. Over here I'm drilling some holes for the screws that will hold on the tuners. Some good old Hipshot open gear locking tuners. Hipshot really does make good stuff. Then I'm installing the nut, or preparing to install the nut. I have to sand down the edges a little bit because it's a little bit wide yet. There's a very snug fit there between the headstock facing and the top of the fretboard. It's definitely not going to fall off on its own. There, once I know the edges are filed down enough that it's going to fit the fretboard nicely, I'm going to take it into my vise and just kind of put an angle on the top of it. I'm going to do that before it's installed so that I don't risk scratching the headstock. There's another test fit. It looks pretty good. So I must not have actually filmed myself gluing it in. Yeah, must not have. So that I was just roughly cutting in the string slots. And here are the pickups for this guitar, also from Crimson Guitars. They're classic hookers. I've had these sitting around for about 2 years by the time I'm actually installing them. Just waiting for the right guitar. I must say the chrome covers do look really nice on this guitar. Now these pickup rings are actually some metal rings, very thin. And they're also sort of a matte black rather than shiny black. So, again, with this build, I didn't really bother filming the wiring process. I've filmed that several times before, and it's, I think, fairly boring to watch. So, if you really need to know how to wire a guitar, I would suggest actually looking up a tutorial on that rather than finding it in a video like this. Alright, so now just doing a quick electronics test to make sure all the wiring's working appropriately. And it's good. So then we just need to put in the strap locks. Alright, so before I throw this over to a friend of mine for the playing demo, just want to run over a few specs for this guitar. It is a ash body, the Zebrawood top and fretboard. The neck is Pau Ferro, and there's an ebony binding on the fretboard as well as an ebony plate on the headstock. The inlay is turquoise, and the knobs are also made of Zebrawood with ebony and turquoise on the top, just for a little bit of style. The pickups are the classic hookers from Crimson Guitars, and it's just a simple 3-way toggle. I really like how this guitar looks, and I hope you enjoyed the build, and I'm going to just go ahead and throw this over for the playing demo.
gonna turn on this blues driver. That was the bridge pickup. Let's move it to the middle. Neck pickup. That's Enter Dustman. it's a completely different song.